Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 WFAN Conference Keynote Address. I hope that everyone is enjoying the conference so far. A huge thanks to our sponsors, Midwest Foods, Practical Farmers of Iowa, the Minnesota Agricultural Water Quality Certification Program, and the Pesticide Action Network. We also want to give so much gratitude to all of our presenters and facilitators and to our WFAN support team that have been helping this event be a success along the way. Our keynote speaker today embodies WFAN's values right down to the very roots. She is a farmer and an activist. She is co-owner and farmer at Rise and Root Farm in Chester, New York. And as a tireless activist and food advocate in 2010, co-founded Black Urban Growers, or BUGS, an organization supporting growers in both urban and rural settings. In 2012, Ebony magazine voted her one of the 100 most influential African Americans in the country, and in 2014 was the recipient of the James Beard Leadership Award. Recently, in 2020, Essence magazine named her one of their Essential Heroes recipient. She serves on the boards of the New York Botanical Gardens, Soulfire Farm, the Mary Mitchell Center, Black Farmer Fund, and Farm School, New York City, NYC. Folks, let's please give a warm welcome to Karen Washington. Karen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my goodness. I'm in a room with some women farmers, you all. So I'm so glad to be here. Amy, thank you so much, because the reason why I'm here, because Amy asked me to come, and this is why I'm here. And so first I want to give gratitude to all the WFAN members, people out there, women farmers, especially those that, came to the forefront in time of need, all the farmers, the gardeners, the farm workers that came to the challenge of feeding people during this pandemic. So I want to take time to thank all those who were able to do that. So my talk is going to be about food justice more than growing food and feeding people. And I say that because just think about it. A lot of people don't understand where their food comes from, who grew it, if it was sprayed with pesticides or insecticides, or if the people who are growing the food were treated humanely. Next slide. This slide, talks about food security. So in 1996, you can see this. Go back, Amy, a little, please. In 1996, the World Food Summit defined food security as existing when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. Yet there were people pointing their fingers at poor urban and rural communities saying that, wow, if you want food security, if you want to be food secure, all you got to do, folks, is give up soda and drink water, eat vegetables, exercise, as if by magic. Eating vegetables and drinking water was going to solve the problem in our food system without looking at the institutional, environmental, and structural determinants that reinforce racism in today's society. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in New York City, the Big Apple, skyscrapers and everything. The closest thing for a farm for me was a park. And for animals, it was a zoo or a circus. Even in school, they never talked about agriculture unless it was a nursery rhyme. 3 little piggies went to market, or Old MacDonald had a farm. But I never questioned the food system. So far removed from land and from my food source, it never occurred to me how lost I truly was. Granted, my mom was a good cook, 3 meals a day, but I was dependent on a food system where everything came from a grocery store or department store. In fact, becoming a farmer and going back to the land as a Black person, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to do that when growing up, farming as a Black person meant slavery? And why would I want to do something that was harmful and demeaning? But somewhere along the line, I got this urge to try and grow food. And it started with my backyard. I had no idea about growing food. All I knew that I had to do something, moving to the Bronx with a big backyard. And I decided to grow 3 things. Tomatoes, because my mom loved tomatoes, but I hated tomatoes because they were pink and they tasted like cardboard. Eggplant, because an eggplant sounded funky. I'm going to grow eggs on a plant? What? And collard green. But it was the tomato that changed my world because, folks, first of all, it didn't grow in a supermarket. It grew on a vine. What? It wasn't pink. It was red. And when I bit into it, woo, the juices were flowing. I was hooked, and I wanted to grow everything from pineapples to mangoes, and quickly knew I couldn't do it. But I never lost that interest, that compassion. Next slide, Amy. And so for me, my world started to change when I started to look at land issues. And that came about back in the 1980s. Can you believe at one time New York City had over 15,000 vacant lots, mostly in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color? People that could move, they call it white flight. They left. They went to the suburbs. But people who could not move, next slide, Amy, stayed and turned those empty lots into community gardens. But folks, initially, it wasn't about food. It was about survival. It was about beautification. But it came at a cost. It came at a cost because in 1998, the city decided, you know what? These gardens look really, really good. They're changing the complexion of the neighborhood. So let's auction off 100 community gardens to the highest developers. Next slide. And so folks who never delved into politics all of a sudden found themselves active in a political system that was challenging their civil rights as citizens. This was a turning point for me and others that realized land in a municipality has political consequences. I became very proactive in the community garden movement for land preservation and protection. And I bring this up because right now, a lot of cities are looking towards urban agriculture as a potential food source, but at what cost? What we need to question that comes up time and time again is the fact that who owns the land and how are decisions going to be made? Now, while I was in that garden, growing food, next slide, Amy, I realized that there were so many social issues that were going on. So I just couldn't concentrate on just growing food because I started to hear the social issues around affordable housing, no heat, no hot water, unable to pay rent, or health. The fact that so many people were now being exposed to type 2 diabetes, hypertension, obesity, economics, low-paying jobs or no jobs, and the environment, high incidence of asthma. Knowing this led me to question the food system and its policies. How in the greatest country, folks, the greatest country where we grow enough food and we waste enough food, that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most. Just think about it. Still today, 40 million people in poverty, hungry, homelessness. The way the food system has impacted my community caused me and others to question the food system, but not only to question the food system, but to challenge it. Many of you have heard time and time again that the food system is broken and it needs to be fixed. And I too at one time was believing that. I was drinking that Kool-Aid until I realized it's doing just fine. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's a caste system based on power and privilege. For so long, I've been hearing about the struggle for healthy food and clean water. Yet when we fail to question question the food system, it brings to the surface the social economic disparities we often see in communities of color and poor folks. And when we don't talk about these things and act upon these things, it reinforces a food system that is controlled by a handful of people with power. Food alone has no power, but now has become a commodity and has been used as a tool to have power over others. Folks, it is estimated by 2050, we will have an additional 2 billion more people on this planet, up from 7.8 billion to almost 9 billion people. And most of those people will be living in urban areas. So can we say that today's industrialization running parallel with the advancement of technology and the mass industrial production of food is what we need when we know where most of that food ends up? For years, we talked about a country, the country being the land of milk and honey, but has it now become the land of greed and money? The next slide. This pandemic has exposed some of our weaknesses. The fact, again, we have a handful of companies controlling the food supply of billions and billions of people. We've gone from diversity to monocropping based on a single commodity crop, such as corn and soy. Farm subsidies that were supposed to help the farmers back in the 1930s has now become a cash cow and a dumping ground for processed food entering our food chain with no nutritional values. We've gone from local markets to global markets because of trade agreements, from home cooking to fast food eating. And lastly, from seasonality to growing and eating food all year round. Just think about it. Here in New York, we're eating watermelon and peaches and cherries in December. Can we actually say that we're much better off because we have a system that is less labor intensive, more efficient and mechanized, or more specialized due to technology? Next slide, please. The American diet, which was once plant-based, full of vegetables and fruits and legumes, now animal-based. And as a result, our caloric intake has increased from 2,000 calories per capita to over 3,800 calories per capita. This is not healthy. A subsidized charity-based food system's byproduct ends up where? It ends up in poor neighborhoods. It's cheap with no nutritional value. For years, I have criticized this charity-based food system that has been used as a grocery store instead as an emergency food provider. This system is not sustainable now, or should it be?
Okay.
This industrial food complex victimizes the poor. Long before COVID, there would be people lining up in underserved communities, getting their food from soup kitchens and food pantries.
Okay.
We have known that for quite some time that there's a correlation between the food that we eat and the health of our bodies. We know that healthy food winds up in more affluent neighborhoods and unhealthy food in poor neighborhoods. Folks, this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call for us to challenge the food system, especially during COVID. Even our farming habits have changed. Our farming habits have changed because the system has become more data-driven, more analytical. Consumers now want food that is fresh, local, and healthy. Consumers realize in order to fight this disease, we must be healthy and eat healthy. Technology also must do a better job in seeing that all aspects of the food chain has equal access to technology and data. However, what we must remember is that the data must be checked. We must make sure that data is used for the good and not for the worse. But this does not happen without resources and training. For me, this is why STEM education is so important in our schools. Globally, the population of farmers and growers are women, yet we too lack access to technology, land, and capital to succeed. Today, women in ag have vast opportunities. There's nearly 1 million women, folks, in farming. Nearly a third of farmers are women. We generate at least $12 billion in revenue. But we're not only farmers, folks. We're chefs, economists, entrepreneurs, owners, and operators of small businesses. We are policymakers and activists. We are involved in every aspect of agriculture. Yet with all that we have accomplished, all that we have gained, we have allowed ourselves to be fragmented along racial, economic, social, and demographic lines. Wealth, opportunity, and resources are still afforded to those with privilege. And if we're going to talk about women's contribution towards farming, we must talk in terms of the globalization of agriculture. You see, women in agriculture is not an isolated local movement. To see us in isolation strips us of our power as a unified force to be reckoned with. For eons, women have been the backbone of agriculture. Yet, we have been and still are victims of oppression, income and gender inequality, inadequate education, lack of political representation, and lastly, lack of power. Even today, we lack the respect and recognition of our place in the annals of history. Here in the United States, although we have some growth in the number of women farmers, however, the land that we own by women is dismal. And for women of color, non-existent. And like most farmers, especially small farmers, we struggle to make ends meet. And most of us have second jobs. As farmers and growers, climate change will dictate. It's not about us growing more, it's how do we grow more efficiently? The commodification of our food has caused us to focus more on profits and less on people in our environment. So now I'm going to ask that question again. Does the food system need to be fixed? Is it broken? And I say it doesn't need to be fixed, it needs to change. And that change comes with shifting of power. Power must go back into the hands of the people, the community. For so long, we have been silent and complacent, y'all. We have given up our power to lobbyists, the government, big ag. We must shift the power dynamics of our food system that leaves the poor, women, and communities of color powerless and victimized. So when does the power dynamic of our food system show up in our society? Well, it shows up as hunger when we don't have it. It shows up as poverty when we can't afford it. It shows up as it's killing us, diet-related disease. It shows up when the food that we need, that's so important, is so expensive, as organic food. And it shows up as big ag when others control it. Next slide. Understanding the power that we have in community means changing the way we view ourselves holistically and not how outsiders say or think we should be. Many times, people in marginalized communities or poor communities with limited resources and capital are looked at in terms of being needy, deficit, scarcity, and problems. Even me had to change my lens on how I look at my community, living in a poor community, because I saw how my community was strong and vibrant. When thinking about who we are, we need to think about our assets, our capabilities, and our solutions. Asking the community what we need comes from a position of deficit. Ask us what we want comes from a position of power. We must value our social capital and communal wealth. What does that look like? What does that mean, social capital? It means that everybody in this country has value. Collectively, we have the power to change, but many times we're pitted against one another based on bias or external factors. Next slide. For example, before the pandemic, I heard people call communities with limited access to food or supermarket a food desert. Get it out your system, food desert. And then I started hearing food mirage. And then I started hearing food swamp. Folks, really? I live in a swamp, a mirage, a desert? I said, no. Again, outsiders putting terms on people. And I said, I'm going to change that phrase because I don't live in a desert, I don't live in a swamp, and I don't live in a mirage. It's a political construct and brief from outsiders that would have us to believe that we don't have food or we don't have supermarkets. Yes, we do. We have the fast food, we have the junk food, we have the processed food. What we don't have are healthy food options. So I coined the term food apartheid, and that got people listening. And I coined that term food apartheid because I wanted the people to stop and peel down the food system and look at the food system for what it is. Look at the food system and start having the talks about the effects of systemic racism, income inequality, hard conversations that we don't have. We have a system based on the haves and have-nots. And until we recognize that healthy food and clean water are rights for all, we must continue to have these hard conversations. Next slide. Another term that people have used is food justice. And I tell people that y'all don't co-opt that term. And I say that because the term has been used to pad people's RFPs, their programs. And I got this definition out because I like this definition when it says food justice represents a transformation of the current food system, including but not limited to eliminating disparities and inequities. And I like this because I looked at the word transformation. And so when people talk about food justice, I don't want to hear your definition about food justice, because food justice is not a passive movement, it's an active movement. And so in order for you to be doing work on food justice, you have to be actively working on dismantling some of the social injustices that you see. Next slide. So what are some of the social injustices that we see? Well, we see social injustice when regard to race and gender and class. The lack of opportunity to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. What does that mean? It's lacking the opportunity of people within their community to make decisions. The lack of land, the loss of land due to theft, racism, displacement, and that mighty G word, gentrification. The injustice around the lack of a living wage job for people who have been working for so long. And yet we have an economy where wealth is 11% more than Black and Latinx people. Understanding the historical content of trauma. Again, we shy away from having those hard conversations on how this country was built. And lastly, the social injustice when it comes to power. For many of us, we have a food and economic system that is extractive. We see our resources and money moving out of our community. We work outside our community. We bank outside our community. We travel outside our community. So when we talk about correcting this situation, it's through base building and communal wealth. So what does that look like? Communal wealth. What it aligns with the principles of the next slide, please. Food sovereignty. Again, it's been co-opted. And I say that because food sovereignty was started by peasants and farmers in the global South. And it's the rights of people and governments to choose the way food is produced and consumed in order to respect the livelihoods as well as the policy that support that choice. La Via Campesino. The goal is less dependency on capital-intensive inputs that extract and greater attention to the social and environmental principles that build communal wealth. In principle, it's about equity in the decision-making process and the distribution of resources when it comes to the common good of people. Power must be placed back into the hands of people, thus advocating for better control over food production and consumption by people who have been marginalized by those with power over them. Power, that word power. Change starts with giving up power. But folks, it's very difficult to do because you know power is a drug and people with power, they don't want to give it up. But as long as we have a food system that embraces a power dynamic society over having power over others, it will remain stagnant and resistant to change. From small farmers to growers to food and farm workers, a healthy food system is not just about growing food, but making sure everyone along that food chain is treated fairly and humanely. Food has become a commodity based on profits and not on people. In order for the food system to change, we must face the fact it's about giving up or sharing power. A food system that is dominated by white privilege with a historical frame of power over others has to acknowledge that power and give it up. More than ever, this pandemic has forced us to redefine what community looks like. We have now engaged folks to focus on a local food system that supports local businesses, small farms, farm workers, and locally grown food. Next slide. So, what are some of the essential work that people are doing to see that shift in power? Well, they're reclaiming land, developing small farms, community gardens, urban farms, community land trusts, and starting to address the conversation and ideas of land reparation. Because of COVID, all of a sudden, people want to grow food on their front yard, their backyard, windowsills, backyards, terraces. Understanding that in order to be healthy, you have to eat healthy. They're growing food that's culturally appropriate because they can't find it in a local grocery store. They're developing educational curriculum around agriculture that's truth-based and inclusive. They're saving seeds in the defiance of big companies that feel it's their God-given right to patent seeds. They're growing medicinal herbs and culinary herbs because they know this is medicine for their communities. Next slide. They're forming cooperatives, coalitions, investment funds. They're taking back their narrative about how this country was built. They're speaking up and speaking out when they see injustice. They're forming community-based farmers markets, food co-ops, CSAs, food boxes, food chairs. They're supporting small and local farmers. They're having virtual conferences, webinars, and workshops on skill sharing and talking about issues that affect them, given by people who look like them. They're forming local economies around wealth building and investment. Next slide. Together, we must change the food system by speaking up and advocating for the support and rights of farm workers, restaurant workers, grocery workers. We now know who the essential workers are. Support those working on access to land and affordable housing. Be open to the idea of those who had their land lost or stolen to talk about what reparations would look like. Demand healthy food and clean water for all. Both are human rights. Support the right to save seeds and the right to have all food labeled. Next slide. Speak up against hazardous working conditions at major food facilities and businesses. Make sure our elected officials are accountable. Ask questions, demand answers. Break bread or have a meal with a person outside of your community. Make yourself feel uncomfortable to be comfortable. Speak up and speak out when you see injustice. Strive for a community that cherishes diversity and inclusion as assets. Let's develop and support youth leadership. They are our next generation of leaders. You know, a couple of months ago, I was asked this question. I was asked, how can agriculture continue to focus on healing and regenerate our landscape with being inclusive to all? And I had to sit back and sort of ponder about that question. Because I said, to be honest, we can't focus on healing until we acknowledge the trauma that so many of us have experienced. The trauma when it comes to people, animals, and our planet. You know, we never fully address the evils of enslavement or the eradication of indigenous people. We kept that part of our history hidden or intentionally erased, not to face the ills and sins of our country. The fact that we have developed an economic system based on capitalism that has been extractive and exploitative, focused more on profits and people, is something that we need to reckon with. We have shied away from having a truthful conversation on how wealth was built on this country, who has access to land, capital, and resources. In fact, next slide. The majority of farmers, folks, are women, we women. Yet we're not given the recognition we deserve. And what about women farm workers? They too do a tremendous job. Yet where are their voices, seeming invisible as they fight for decency, fair wages, and health benefits? Folks, our global sisters in developing countries are facing similar challenges. They make up almost half of the world's farmers, and over the last few decades have broadened their involvement in agriculture. Still, we have allowed diverse rhetoric to become our main narrative due to silence and complacency. So for me, that question, the question that needs to be answered, and for me, what embodies agriculture is culture. Culture embodies diversity. It embraces our differences. A monolithic approach to growing food does not work from a standpoint of what we grow to who is growing our food. Our food landscape has changed. There are people with power and privilege controlling most of our industrial food system, namely white men. Yet the vast majority of people who are growing our food are women and people of color. Today, food has been an essential part of our lives. People are now growing food, but they're growing food not only in rural communities, but urban communities as well. This is our defining moment to examine and challenge the food system. We now know that eating healthy and being healthy are essential tools to living. In the name of food justice, agriculture must be fair and just. Healthy food must be a human right for all, along with water. We must see that the opportunity to have land and grow food is an option for all and not for some. We must acknowledge the practices of indigenous people and not co-opt their practices as new discoveries. When we talk about what it means to be inclusive, that means having the power to make decisions in all aspects of agriculture, from politics, regulations, laws, and a seat at the table. So women, we must band together. We must share our resources, share our land, purchase from one another, support one another. The air of complacency, fear, falsehoods, and lack of empathy stemming from injustices are tools being used against us. We have a right to speak up against injustice. We have a right to demand equal pay. We have a right to demand equal pay for equal work. We have a right to demand access to land, grants, loans, technology. In this digital age, no farmer should be without the means of communication, and yet we still have a digital divide. As we come together, let us recognize our collective power as women and demand change. For the world is changing, and in the midst of this change, it's going to be we, us women, who will be at the forefront, the first line of defense. Women must be at the table and not on the menu when it comes to the decision-making process. Our ideas and voices matter. Today, let us recognize and appreciate the efforts of all women farmers and those of past generations on whose shoulders we stand on. Together, let's celebrate our triumphs, victories, sacrifices, as we recognize the importance and contribution of women in the field of agriculture. We have a powerful story to tell, one of self-reliance, determination, stewardship, and leadership. We have a unique opportunity to change a system which we should recognize our diversity and inclusion as assets. Finally, let us lift our voices and our shovels together. The impact from COVID has magnified the inequities we see along hunger and poverty. This is our time. We are not going back. We must reach across communities and states and nations. We now have engaged consumers to focus on a food system that supports us, supports the small farmers, the farm workers, locally grown food. Our food system, on one hand, is simple, on the other hand, complex. There are dots along the way that we must connect, from the person that puts that seed in the ground to the person that delivers your plate. Together, this food movement is ours to take back. We must all play a role in building a healthy food system that is fair, just, and equitable for all, and it starts with each and every one of us. Last slide. In closing, I want to leave you with this quote by Jen Poo, the Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She states, "The greatest thing we did was we began to listen to our own stories. And that's when it happened. We stopped looking up to those in power and started looking around at the women standing beside us from different backgrounds, working in different sectors of different ethnicities with different stories, and realize our strength is not in our individualism, but in our diversity, and the power that we need to claim it is our own. Next slide. My name is Karen Washington. I tell people I'm a farmer. I grow food. I feed people body, mind, and spirit. To grow your own food gives you power. You know who and why you grew it. You grew it for yourself, your family, and your community. Thank you so much for having me. This has been great. Understand collective power that we have as women together. Thank you. Yeah, folks, it's time for some Q&A. It's time to digest what I said. It's time to get working. Yeah, it's time to change the system. Are you ready to change the system? So I don't know who's handling the questions and answers, but
I'm happy I can moderate the chat box, folks. If anyone wants to drop questions in the chat box, or I'm sure Karen would be happy if folks unmuted themselves and wanted to just talk to you directly, human to human.
Yeah, talk to me. I can't see people. I'm on a view that has me just seeing myself.
It looks like the chat is disabled.
All right, folks, unmute yourself and talk to Mama Kay.
Okay, Mama Kay, this is Denise O'Brien in Iowa.
What's up, Denise?
Hi, sister. I just want to say that you bringing up the World Food Summit in 1996, I was there. I was there with 35 women from 29 countries all over, and we had a rural women's statement. And I've been looking through my files as I've been listening to you to try to find that rural statement, but I'll find it and share it with everybody. But that was, we were together for like 3 days, and we chose a woman to go to the summit and deliver our statement. And we had actually, we fought the Farm Bureau because they would not recognize food as a human right. And so we were in a real, and I bet they still don't. But anyway, thank you for mentioning that. And I'll find that statement so we can share it with the women, because it's a really good statement.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Denise. Who else got some questions? Come on, now it's the time for us to be talking. We women now, you know, take off the gloves. What is that we can do together? Questions.
I got a question for you, Mama Kay.
I love you, friend. You know, friend, you know, we're sisters. We're in this activism together. As a matter of fact, we used to teach advocacy for farm school.
Yes, we did.
All right, talk to me.
We have history. I thank you. I am always grounded by your grounding us in the need to take power, because power is key. And in this moment of, as Rowan White put it the other day, cultural insanity, I'm wondering kind of how you keep it going. We're living in such difficult times politically, and there's so much bad shit going on around the world. And there's also so much good organizing on the ground. So I don't know, I just would love to hear your sage words on how you are dealing with this moment.
Right. The world, and especially the US, is going crazy, y'all. And so what I try to tell people is not look at the big picture, start locally. Start within your community dealing with social issues, Because if you don't start in your community, you don't have the power to even think about tackling social issues. Right now, this country is divided along racial lines, along wealth lines. And so then how do we, and that's those are big shoes to fill, but let's look within our community. What is needed within the local community, within your town, within your community, within your neighborhood? It could be something as important as making sure the streets are safe, or making sure that people are being fed. In my community, what we did is started to look at what COVID has done. It really affected mostly Black and Latinx communities, poor communities of color. And so when the city told us at that time to close the gardens and not go in, we said, hell no. When we opened those gardens and we started coming together to grow more food and started feeding our community. And that's something that needs to be done. The government doesn't talk about that in solving the problem. We locally, we can solve those problems. We can start having this intergenerational relationship that we need to have. We need to start speaking to one another. The elders and the youth need to start speaking to one another instead of going separate ways. And again, those are small things, but those are small things that we can start in our community. And then we can break bread. The most important thing I said, break bread with someone that you don't know. Go into a community of color that you know needs your resources or has your capital, or to sit down and talk about the issues that affect them. We tend to be in our own silos, and we hear and we get a lot of stuff from the media. And a lot of times the media doesn't portray what is happening on the ground. And so for me, start locally. What I'm starting to see is more grassroots organizing of people coming together to tackle social and local issues. Thanks, Fran. I love you. All right, take off the mics. Let's go. This is a conversation for all of us.
I have a question, Karen.
Yeah.
So much for your wonderful talk. And I live in the Southwest, and I wear two hats as a rancher and as a professor at a Native American serving institution. And I'm part of this community of regenerative ag here, but really it seems like a co-optation in many ways of indigenous ag practices here. And I see there's this restoration of indigenous food systems happening here in the Southwest, and this regenerative thing, but they're like happening parallel. And the bridges aren't being built. I feel like the regenerative community is getting quite siloed and remains quite Anglo. And I hear what you're saying about reaching out, and I feel like some of that's happening, but the bridge, it's a hard bridge to build because I think because of that history of trauma and land, and we're settlers on this land that has been stolen. And so any sort of thoughts on?
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because folks, let's be honest. Why are people afraid of history? Why are people afraid of telling the truth? And again, it's about power. People don't want to hear the fact that they're on stolen land. People don't want to hear that they're making large amount of money on the backs of indigenous enslaved people. They don't want to hear that, but we must address that. In order to move forward, we must address the sins and evil of our past, because if we don't, it gets pushed away. And then you have new generations that have such a disconnect that they, listen, 10, 20 years from now, there'll be people say, we weren't on no stolen land. This was our land, because the conversation is stalled, hidden, pushed aside. And as we continue to move forward, that history, that truth is being lost. And so now is the time when we know people are afraid of critical truth learning, especially in school, critical race theory in schools, or just critical learning on how this country was built. Again, it goes towards the fact of people are afraid of losing power when it comes to the truth. And when I hear about regenerative agriculture, permaculture, all these cultures that have been co-opted from indigenous people, What's wrong with us learning from indigenous people and giving them their just due? What is it? Is it the power struggle so much that we have to hold on and claim something that we've co-opted? And so it's time to tear down the falsehoods and the lies and have people understand with integrity, with truth, how this country was built. And even though it might be painful, we need to understand so that the power dynamics is shift. Folks, you can see what is happening. And I'm not trying to be political, but we see what is happening in different parts of our country when we're so divided. And in essence, there's only one race, it's the human race. And when we look at our lifespan, how can we, I always talk about owning. How do we own anything? How do we have the capacity of owning anything when our life is so short? We're gone, we still own it? We don't own anything. And I always talk about stewardship. I don't see myself owning anything. What I do see myself as being a steward of the land, that I can be a caregiver of the land, and I can pass that down from generation to generation. But owning, how do you own something when you don't live long enough to achieve that? And so again, taking away those terms that divide us, extractive terms, and again, having those conversations, sitting at a table, breaking bread. Yeah, thank you, Carrie. All right, who else? Come on, sisters. It's showtime. I see Laurel Smith, but I can't hear you. You're on mute.
I'm
Hi, Kathy.
hi.
Hi, Kathy.
I'm here in my West Coast kitchen. It's early out here, forced into farmers' hours. There are a couple of your overall talk and as a worldview, is great. I'm not arguing with anything there. I struggle to apply that to, I'm one of those maligned absentee landowners. And the things that you talk about are beautiful in a space where you can get out and do it. But I don't know where to get an intellectual handle on fitting the kinds of things that you're talking about to 160 acres of dry land farm in the Midwest. It's just, it's wonderful, all the pictures of farms and stuff, but I can't put them together I don't know where to start with that stuff. And the other thing that bothers me is I don't understand what the difference is between co-opting and learning from. I mean, we go, oh, Picasso went to Africa and got interesting ideas and he drew differently. Is that co-opting or is that opening your mind to other things? And I'll stop babbling.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much of the land that you have on. So when I talk about co-opting, I'm talking about people taking claim for certain ideas without giving the proper due on how that idea started. Okay. For instance, people talk about food sovereignty all the time, but food sovereignty was started, and give credit where credit's due, was started by peasants and farmers in the global South. So when we talk about things, let's talk about in terms of giving credit to where things were started. Right now, we're doing a lot of land acknowledgement. That has 10 years ago, that was never done before, because we always thought that, and I was taught in school that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Is that true? You know what I'm saying? Is it no, but so when I'm saying how things are being co-opted, or how certain principles are being co-opted and people making it their own and not giving credit to the indigenous people that have been here. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to your land, and I tell people that have land and they want to know, like, I got this land, how can I get people involved in land? You know what? A lot of people don't open up their land or their ideas to people. There's so many young people that want to farm, that are looking for land. And yet you have people that stand behind and says, well, I have this land, but I don't see any people wanting to be involved. I don't see people trying to or want to farm. And I tell people who have land, there are colleges, there are nonprofits, there are so many outlets out there for people who want to learn how to farm. I grew up in a city. I grew up in New York City. What woman or child growing up in New York City would even think about farming? But I had the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of elders who taught me about farming, the stories about how it was to farm, and the opportunity. Someone gave my farm partners and I the opportunity to farm. And a lot of that we don't do. So again, when we talk, glad for you had that conversation. Hopefully that it helps in terms of what co-opting means, because I think a lot of things that are being said around agriculture, we need to make sure that we put it in its proper perspective. And I think that there are new inventions, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, these new ideas, about crop rotation or about medicinal medicine is all of a sudden it's just brainstorming, where in fact those things have been done by indigenous people for so long. Thank you so much. Next person. Kathy, you're the best. Who else is next? Come on, folks. How much time do I got?
Karen, can I ask a question?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much. So much. Amazing. You have me thinking about so many great things.
Right.
I am a lecturer in the psychology department at the University of Iowa. My lens is very different in that I focus on consumption of food, so the end point of it. And when I teach, I taught a psychology of food class over the years, and I really focus on the idea of getting students to understand how they interface with food, not like actually eating of the food, buying of the food, right? And how that connects to identity and biology and just culture in general. And I like your approach to history, but I'm not a historian, right? Do you have any advice on how to get my students to connect with the food so that they even want to learn about the history, so that they can look forward?
I love this question. The greatest assets that we have that we seem to dismiss are elders. I tell people, when I give talks, I tell people, take out those take out those Samsung Galaxies and iPhones and speak to grandma, grandpa, great uncle, great aunt, abuela, folks that have been on farms, and capture those stories. We don't use that resource of elders that have the knowledge about growing food and bring them in. Bring a bunch of senior citizens in your class. They would love to talk about food. They would love to talk about how it was growing food, how it was the hardship of growing food. We don't tap into that gift of elder knowledge. And I say that because, folks, if we don't do that, 10 to 20 years, the whole history is going to change. And people will say, your family never grew anything. Your family never had land. This is why I try to tell people, young people, capture those stories. Yes, some of the stories are very, very hard, because I used to speak to my patients. I was a physical therapist. I forgot to say that at one time. And I would love to. And so I was a holistic physical therapist. That meant that besides restoring function, I could not treat my patient unless I knew their diagnosis and I had to know their eating habits. So I would come in my initial evaluation and go into the kitchen, open up the refrigerator and the cabinets. They said, Ms. Washington, you're the therapist. You're supposed to be giving me exercise and walk. I said, no, I'm not. I said, I can't treat you unless I know that you're eating well. And I would go into the refrigerator of the diabetics and see the sodas and the cookies and open up that freezer and see that ice cream, open up that cabinet and see them candies and cookies. And I would have this dialogue with them. And I said, listen to me, I'm a farmer and I'm trying to help you. You need to eat better. Ms. Washington, a farmer, oh, how could you? That was such hard work. But then I said, guess what? I got hooked on growing a tomato. I have chickens in my garden and I love to eat their eggs. All of a sudden, the temperature went down. And they said, Ms. Washington, you were right. We were never sick a day in our lives. We got all our food from off the farm. And when people didn't have, we shared it. And all of a sudden, that knowledge came back. And they understood how powerful it was to grow their own food. And they said, look at me now. I have succumbed to machines and medication. And so again, folks, if you have elders, and elders want something to do. And this is why sometimes I get so upset here in the city when people are in senior centers and there's not that interaction between seniors and youth. I tell youth, especially in colleges, go to senior citizens, sit down, pick their brains, write down, their recipe for growing foods, putting seeds, doing things, saving seeds, all those things. We have a wealth of knowledge that we don't capture from our elders. So that's an excellent question. Do I still have time?
Hey, Karen, yeah, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Absolutely.
All right, folks, y'all got it going. Let's go. Let's hear it. Come on, women farmers, let's hear it. Two more questions. Shout it out. Someone get off the mute.
Hi, Mama Kay. My name is Heather Medina. I am not a farmer, but I love farmers. I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Oregon. And I just appreciate your conversation, everything that you said today, but especially the comments related to trauma. And I identify as a Chicana. I'm originally born and raised in Michigan. And similar to you, it seems like some of our historical growing up in our families, the way we were raised and born in our families, going in agriculture is not always seen as something that is good. And it's part of our culture. And I appreciate you talking about that. But I'm also learning about how the trauma from our grandparents and our past grandparents lives in us, and that putting our hands in the soil is very therapeutic and helps us to release that trauma. So thank you and appreciate your comments.
Heather, this is why I farm. Thank you so much. And that's another conversation we need to have when we talk about trauma, because even though it's been over 200, 300 years as an African-American of enslaved people, that trauma still resonates. It's imprinted in your DNA. And again, we tend to it's hidden, but it rises to the surface. It rises to the surface when we're in places that people tend to abuse us, oppress us, talk over us, take our language, culture, ideas away from us, and put us in holes, put us in a peg that doesn't exist for us. Do you know how many times I have gone to conferences, webinars, workshops in a sea of whiteness? Thousands and thousands of farmers are there, and people will say the conference was excellent. And I look around, I see 5 people that look like me. And I sit there and I hear the references of farming, ideas, tools, everything from a white perspective. And I hear no one saying anything about my people's contribution to agriculture. No one never mentions George Washington Carver. Booker T. Watley, Fannie Lou Hamer. And you sit there and you wonder, how do I fit in? How do I fit in the American experience? And again, until we have those conversations on how enslaved and indigenous people have been part of the American history experience, trauma will continue to persist. And there are people who are afraid. They'll tell you, well, that happened 100 years ago. That wasn't my family that did it. Yes, it was. Because unless we reconcile the trauma, the oppressive behavior that continues to resonate within communities, when we're told by higher powers that, look, you don't want them to come into your neighborhood. I'm preventing them from coming into your neighborhood. What do you think those subliminal messages mean? Or the fact that, poor people need to be put in their place because we can't give them power. We can't give them the opportunity, because if we give them the opportunity to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, that means they move into our neighborhoods. And when Black and Latinx people or people of color move into our neighborhood, our property values go down. That is the consciousness of people. Or if you're in a white neighborhood and all of a sudden Black and Latinx start moving your neighborhood, what is the first thing you think? You don't think about embracing. You're thinking about, what the hell are these people moving into my neighborhood? You may not say it overtly, but you sure daggone are thinking about it. When you see a bunch of Black and Latinos moving in your neighborhood, you want to know what the heck is up, because you've lived in a neighborhood that's predominantly white. And again, it's hard. It is hard to have those conversations. It's hard to give up power. It's hard to see change when you're so used to living in a bubble that doesn't embrace diversity and inclusion. And it's scary. But again, people have to understand that. Let me tell you something. I am 67 years of age, and I guarantee you, Black don't crack, but I guarantee you, 20 years from now, this country is going to change. It is going to be more diverse. So how do we go forward to embrace the diversity? Because at the end of the day, there's one race. What is that, y'all? The human race. That's it. It's going to change. So are we going to be on board? Are we going to shy away? Because you cannot continue to push people who all of a sudden are no longer the minority, become the majority. And the fear amongst whites is that as the community grows more diverse, becomes more educated, becomes more emboldened to have power, that they're going to do the same thing we did to them. That's the fear. The fear is that they're going to take over and take away our liberties and take away our way of life, instead of understanding that diversity is what agriculture is all about. As farmers, we strive for diversity in our plants, in our animals. Why can't we do the same thing when it comes to our people? Y'all got me going. I guess, Amy, that's it, right? Because y'all gonna cut the mic. This has been great.
Thank you.
Y'all have been fabulous. I love the best part of the speech is always the Q&A. You know what I'm saying? Because you go on, you have a script and you go through the script, but at the end of the day, it's being human. Being human. We're women, folks. We are the caretakers. Let's try to embolden and embody what culture is all about, what diversity is all about, and who we are. Let's change this system to be more loving and healing, and share what we have. And we know people who are not eating, and share it with love. We only have one life on this planet. I want to go out with a blast. I want to go out making sure I made a difference in somebody's life, be it a kind word, thought, a deed, or serving them some food, or giving them something, giving them the coat on my back. You know what I'm saying? Let's make a difference. We women, we're strong, independent, resilient. All right, Amy, I think y'all done took my essence. Y'all done took the essence, and whatever final words you got to say, and yeah.
Love you, Mama Kay.
Got it. Thank you so much, Karen. We needed that. We all needed that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Can't thank you enough.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.